Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Welcome to Cineversary, a podcast that celebrates a milestone anniversary of a masterful work of cinema. Every month, we send happy birthday wishes to a different film currently observing a joyous jubilee, from a 20th all the way up to a 100th anniversary. This is your devoted host, Eric Martin, creator of the Cineverse blog and moderator of the weekly Cineverse film discussion group. And if you've just found our show, come on in. If you're a regular listener, we are, of course, delighted to see you back. 90 years ago, the movies were changed forever when a much larger-than-life persona hit the big screen, stamped his gigantic presence upon Hollywood, and bedazzled audiences everywhere. This film's impact sent reverberations throughout the industry and set the template for today's modern special effects blockbuster spectacle. That movie was King Kong, originally released on March 2nd, 1933, co-directed and co-produced by Merian C. Cooper and Ernest Schoedsack. A monster as gargantuan and a film as colossally beloved as King Kong deserves extra attention, right? So this month we have the pleasure of sharing interviews with three fantastic guests, each of whom has a special tie to King Kong and are the perfect experts to share details, insights, and personal memories about this movie. First up, we'll hear from visual effects wizard and stop-motion animator extraordinaire Phil Tippett, who, as you would likely imagine, credits King Kong with inspiring him to pursue his craft. Then we will introduce Ray Morton, author of King Kong, the history of a movie icon from Fay Wray to Peter Jackson. And lastly, we'll be joined by TV actor, director, screenwriter, and producer Richard Correll, who was instrumental in bringing King Kong back to theaters years ago for its 50th anniversary. Together, my guests and I will take the scenic route from Skull Island to the Empire State Building as we explore why Kong still matters, how it has stood the test of time, its huge imprint on cinema, and more. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about with King Kong, but we need to set the table, so to speak, before our three-part interview feast by looking a bit closer at the backstory on this seminal movie. And for that, we turn to the trusty text of Wikipedia. King Kong is a 1933 American pre-code adventure horror monster film directed and produced by Merian Cooper and Ernest Schoedsack, with special effects by Willis O'Brien. Produced and distributed by RKO Radio Pictures, it's the first film in the King Kong franchise. This movie stars Fay Wray, Robert Armstrong, and Bruce Cabot. King Kong is well known for its groundbreaking use of special effects, such as stop-motion animation, matte paintings, rear projection, and miniatures, all of which were conceived decades before the digital age. The numerous prehistoric creatures inhabiting Skull Island were brought to life through the use of stop-motion animation by O'Brien and his assistant animator, Buzz Gibson. The iconic fight between Kong and the Allosaurus took 7 weeks to be completed, in fact. Murray Spivak provided the sound effects for the film, and maestro Max Steiner wrote the hugely influential score. King Kong opened in New York City to rave reviews. In 1991, it was deemed culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant by the Library of Congress and selected for preservation in the National Film Registry. A sequel titled Son of Kong was fast-tracked and released the same year, 1933, with several more films made in the following decades, including 2 remakes made in 1976 and 2005, respectively, and a reboot in 2017. Today, King Kong garners a 96% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes, where its average critical score clocks in at 9 out of 10, and its audience score rates 86%. Kong places number 41 on the American Film Institute's list of the 100 greatest American films of all time.
Well, Denham, the airplane's got it. Oh, no. It wasn't the airplanes. It was beauty killed the beast.
Okay, Mr. Denham, but did Beauty also kill the original theatrical trailer to King Kong? We'll never know, but the trailer that survives is for the 1938 reissue, so let's give it a spin.
wild, weird, wonderful, the stuff for which movies were made. Adventure, to make you wonder if it's true, while your eyes convince you that it is. Truly, the thrill of thrills. Don't miss it this time.
Even if you've never laid eyes on the 1933 King Kong, you probably know how the story turns out, right? I mean, our collective pop culture consciousness is embedded with the image of a giant gorilla climbing and summiting the Empire State Building. Nevertheless, consider me your Jiminy Cricket-like voice of conscience, imploring you to hit the pause button now and go watch the film in its entirety if, indeed, Kong has been a blind spot for you. This will help you avoid spoilers and also ridicule from the classic film lovers community. We're confident that after finally watching Kong, you'll echo Carl Denham's unbridled enthusiasm.
Holy mackerel, what a show!
And now, it's my honor to bring to the Cineversary microphone one of the great geniuses of cinematic visual effects, Mr. Phil Tippett. We have a very special voice joining us this month on Cineversary. You've seen his amazing effects work in all-time genre classics like Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi, Dragon Slayer, RoboCop, Jurassic Park, Starship Troopers, and most recently, Mad God. As an Oscar-winning master of stop-motion animation and visual effects, he's the perfect guest to talk King Kong with me, and I'm honored to speak with him. Let's welcome Phil Tippett. Hello, Phil.
Hi there.
Wonderful to have you. So, can you recall when and where you first watched King Kong and your initial reaction?
I can. I was 5 years old in 1956, and it was on a very tiny, which is how they made television sets, black and white television set. And I recall being both mesmerized and frightened by, all of the dinosaurs, and hid behind a chair. But that sparked an interest in paleontology that developed over the years, and I became, a very amateur paleontologist. And I would get my parents to take me to the library in San Diego, and I would just spend the day there going through all the dinosaur books with index cards and learning all the various eras and epochs. Yeah, so that's where my interest in dinosaurs really began, was with King Kong.
So it's interesting. You are more captivated, arguably, by the creatures that Kong fights. But what about Kong himself? What struck you about him, especially his design? I'm curious because you are known as a fantastic creator of different creatures. So what is it about Kong's design in particular that really impressed you?
Well, it was imaginative. It wasn't like, the Peter Jackson King Kong, which was essentially a mountain gorilla. Kong was a thing unto itself.
Yeah.
That really supported the idea of a mythological character, something you had never seen before. You could not go to the zoo to see King
This
Kong.
is true.
In retrospect, that I think is what really, got my imagination. And I think particularly little boys, they kind of move in two directions. One is for, like steam shovels or football, and the other one is towards, like monsters and dinosaurs.
Yeah, I can relate to the latter as well, because I was around 5 or 6 when I first saw this movie on TV on a small black and white screen, and I had a similar reaction. I was interested in paleontology too, not to the extent that you went to the library and did all those cool things, but yeah, it really fires up the imagination. I'm not trying to say it's a gender-specific thing, but yeah, as a little boy, I could relate to what you were saying. So is it fair to say that Kong and the 1933 version here, it had a pretty good impact on your life and your decision to become an animator or filmmaker?
Oh, absolutely. It all really started there,
Mm.
And one of my mentors, Bill Stromberg, who I helped with his 16 millimeter low budget production of Ray Bradbury's Sound of Thunder, had a print of King Kong, and I have no idea how many times we watched that over and over and over.
Mm.
And he had the ability to make stills of Kong, like just little kind of Polaroid size things. And so I had an entire scrapbook of that stuff. And, I would just go over and over and over it.
Wow. So is it fair to say, I don't mean to belabor the point, but is this film like the one that kind of pushed you over the edge, so to speak, in terms of really perhaps being that catalyst or impetus to become a filmmaker? I'm just curious how much significance you would assign to this movie.
Well, back in the day, things were quite different. They were almost medieval in terms of, the technology we have today and the ability to access anything.
Hmm.
So, I saw King Kong, when I was 6 years or 5 years old. And then I didn't see it for God knows how many years. I mean, it was just totally off the radar. And I lived in an area that didn't have very good, I had 3 channels and
Sure.
not very good, reception. So it was just very difficult to access that stuff.
Yeah, back in those days, you were at the whim of the local television stations that might have the rights or the ability to show an old film, and it could be years between viewings, right?
Yeah, and they would hack it up so it would fit within the commercials and their time
Right.
period too.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really awful. But the thing that really galvanized it for me was in 1958 with Ray Harryhausen's Seven Voyages of Sinbad.
Okay.
Because I
Yep.
was older by then, by like 2 years, but you do a lot of growing up in a couple of years.
Oh, sure.
And so that's what really, kind of zapped my brain.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Harryhausen had such a huge impact on so many, a whole generation of filmmakers, certainly. So just pointing back on Kong, 1933 here, what continues to impress you perhaps about King Kong visually or cinematically, especially for a 90-year-old movie? I don't know if it's been a few years since you've seen it or just from your recollections. Yeah, I mean, this is a vintage film, no question, but what continues to impress you?
Well, really, the producers and director, Marion C. Cooper, the director, and Shodensack,
Hmm.
they were adventurers in the true sense of the word. Bringing back alive kind of guys, and they would go into Africa with a camera. And Cooper was essentially Carl Denham. He would go in and just take a lot of risks and a lot of the anecdotal stuff in the movie, like Denham saying, I tried to shoot a charging rhino once, but the cameraman got scared and ran away, so I had to shoot the rhino myself. I mean, that is like lifted right out of the experience that he'd had.
Mm.
So and they would go into like really dangerous places, so they knew that feeling
Hmm.
and the depth of myths of essentially tribes that had never really seen white people before. All of that really resonated in Kong. It was like imagination born out of reality. I mean, they were all over the place, but you go into some ancient anything like the pyramids or things that belong to the past and have been overgrown. There's a tremendous sense of mystery and the resonant, in the case of the Aztecs, I guess you could call it butchery and evil,
Hmm.
where there were these huge sacrifices. So these places genuinely exude a vibe that is palpable.
Sure.
And I think Cooper was able to cinematically capture that feeling in Kong, like
Hmm.
with the lead up to the wall and all of that. And it's very, very dramatically structured.
Yeah, it's not just a monster movie with creature effects, right? I mean, it's certainly that, but it's also a pretty good cinematic experience, even 90 years later, as you were saying. That it sounds like narratively you're a fan, and just the way they structured the film too. So you're tipping your hat to not only the animator, but also the as you said, the director and the producers as well.
Well, I would say it's the best,
Mm.
because the things that come first, that are kind of cut out from whole cloth, that where nothing existed before. I mean, the 1925 First National picture, the Lost World, was certainly a precursor to it,
Hmm.
but it was lifted from Conan Doyle. But this was Kong was a totally original thing of its own.
That's right. We were talking about creature designs a moment ago. Now, you are famous for creating many, many different creatures, or at least contributing to their design. You think of the Rancor Beast in Return of the Jedi. I recall, of course, the Killer Droid in RoboCop. And my favorite of your work, sir, is the fire-breathing Vermithrax Pejorative in Dragon Slayer. That is just amazing work there. So where does the original King Kong monster rank for you among all-time great creature designs?
Well, it's way up there.
Mhm.
You know, I think I would put, because I was older when I saw it, Ray's Cyclops from the Seven Voyages of Sinbad.
Mm.
But you know, Kong was a key character in a pretty phantasmagorical neighborhood, and that all seemed to fit together as a single thing. You know, whereas the structure of Ray's stories were a little bit like, kind of like the Golden Gate Bridge. There would be these high points, and there'd be a monster, and then there'd be these dips where, you know, there was action, and the structure is very immediately ascertainable. And you know, in many ways, Star Wars is very similar,
Mm-hmm.
except you know, it's certainly bigger budgets and much more designed around the characters, and not around the monsters. The monsters are set pieces, but it's really about Luke and Leia and Han. But Kong was, you know, it didn't have that problem. All of the scenes with the prehistoric animals were really organically integrated into the story.
Right. Good point.
And the shots were alarming in terms of their inventiveness. You know, just the first dinosaur that you see, the Stegosaurus, is like an amazing sense of imagination and understanding how you would actually put a shot together like that, like a big tracking shot
Oh, sure.
in,
Right.
you know, with all of this stuff happening and coordination between the foreground and the rear screen, and the timing of the, you know, stegosaur and all that was, it still amazes me, you know, whenever I watch it.
Yeah, me as well. So why should filmmakers and animators continue to look to the 1933 King Kong for creative inspiration, Phil, even though this is now a 90-year-old movie? Would you advise them to, hey, don't give up on a classic like King Kong. Look to it for what?
Well, you hit the nail on the head for its originality.
Mm-hmm.
And originality is really hard to come by, particularly these days. You know, one of the things that, and I've talked to, you know, Dennis Muren and a number of friends of mine about this, is we were very lucky in that we couldn't see these things that often, and so it was left to our imaginations to come up with things that were different and spectacular in our own minds as kids. And I think that really helped us, you know, as we, you know, became professionals. That idea of spectacle, meaning things you have not seen before.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of what you get in all the plethora of digital imagery, you know, I mean, there's certainly some very fine work, but it's all pretty much a derivation, you know, of something.
What is it that you love most about stop motion animation, Phil? Is it your favorite form of animation to work in?
Yeah, you know, I agree with Ray. I mean, I recall when I was watching television when I was like around, you know, 7 years old, the trailer for Seventh Voyage of Sinbad came on, and I recall, you know, telling my parents, and I really liked the way the creatures moved. They kind of moved like, and I tried to approximate the feeling of stop motion with a pantomime. It's just takes you someplace else.
Mm-hmm.
It wears its heart on its sleeve and embraces the artificiality of it, and it's a really magical combination, or synthesis of a machine that had, you know, been, you know, invented in the mid to late 1800s, combined with art history.
Mm.
And it's a really powerful thing. You really want to be at that place where the engines of invention are like really cooking. And, you know, around that time, and the people that grew up there, you know, it was like the time of Eisenstein and trains and clocks, and,
Right.
you know, and, you know, hyper industrialization. So it was a really vibrant time, and it produced a lot of, you know, significant stuff. I mean, you know, we can't enjoy the significance of the era that we're in, you know, because I think, for many people, every era kind of seems like the end of the world.
Yeah, right. But yet there's still a place in this world, in this cinematic universe, for stop motion animation. And the proof of that is your most recent production, Mad God. Now, you recently wrote, produced, directed, and animated this movie. And it's a stop motion animated adult horror film created over, I was reading, 30 years. Wow, that's perseverance. And this premiered on the streaming service Shudder last year. So, Phil, tell us briefly about what motivated you to create this movie and employ stop motion techniques for it.
Well, first of all, it's not a horror movie.
Okay.
It was purchased by Shudder, which is a horror streaming service. And I think that cinched the nomenclature of, what it was. It's also been called surreal. It is not surreal. And it does not have the juxtapositions of surrealism. It's contiguous in terms of its through line.
Okay.
Again, the stop motion gives it the feeling of this artificiality, which I really embraced. I wanted it to feel like a collage, and there were just a lot of disparate parts that would come together. And I wanted it to seem unreal, and which is an interesting point, in that a lot of times when you go in to have a production meeting with producers and directors and they want to have some phantasmagorical thing, and you ask them what they're looking for, they say it has to be absolutely real. Dennis and I orbit this quite a bit, and I did with Craig Hayes, who designed Ed 209 and the Troopers bugs. You don't try and make anything real. I mean, you can't. I mean, it's like, come on, what the fuck are you thinking about? And you make things hyper real and spectacular, and so it takes on its own life.
Sure.
Of what you're trying to nail is, I've never seen that before. I mean, you've seen reality, and you can only approximate it, but what you need to do is heighten the experience.
Yeah, I totally jive with what you're saying there. And I would celebrate the artificiality of it if you are an animator, like mine, right? Because, as you said, it's creating the new. It's delving into the imagination in ways that aren't necessarily going to translate into reality the way that people think they are. So,
Right.
Yeah, I appreciate that about stop motion animation and your work. So what's up next for Mr. Phil Tippett? Do you have a new film, short, book, appearance, event, project, or otherwise that you're working on or preparing for?
Yeah, I got a couple of things. Apparently, Shudder has some interest, and there's some other streaming services that have some interest in what is being called by the people that are handling all this stuff for me is Mad God 2.
Oh, okay.
So I will be looking for, unlike Mad God, which was pretty much self-produced, I'll be looking for money. It would be a cold day in hell to get the amount of money that I would be necessary to make a sequel to Mad God, which I could not. That is a one-of-a-kind thing.
Sure.
I would not dare even go back to attempt anything like that. So these are more commercially oriented, more, fantasy. One of them has got kind of a Tex Avery, Warner Brothers vibe, very loosely, but more in terms of the hysterical antics that Tex would put into his things. So I've got a couple of those that I will see if anybody bites on.
Well, best of luck with that. We want to continue to see your talents and your work on screen. Phil, our infinite gratitude to you for taking this excursion down King Kong Lane with us. Thank you for this and for everything you do to keep the old school movie magic alive.
Okay, well, my pleasure.
Have a great day, sir.
Thanks. You too. Bye.
So fun to hear from a living legend of special effects and learn how Kong fired up his young imagination. Great stuff there from Phil Tippett, and our gratitude for his time. Now it's time to really get into the nuts and bolts of what makes King Kong work and endure as a movie masterwork, and for that, we turn to Ray Morton. It's time to say hello to Ray Morton, writer, film historian, script consultant, and author of the books Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the making of Steven Spielberg's classic, A Hard Day's Night, music on film, and King Kong, the history of a movie icon from Fay Wray to Peter Jackson. Ray, we're so glad you're here with us on Cineversary to discuss one mighty big personality, King Kong.
Yes, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So let's get into it, Ray. Why does King Kong deserve to be celebrated 90 years later? It's the 90th birthday month of this fantastic film. Why does it still matter, and how has it stood the test of time, in your opinion?
I think it still matters because, number one, it is a classic motion picture. Apart from its influence in special effects and things, it's one of the great movies of Hollywood's golden era.
Hmm.
It is a landmark film in special effects,
Right.
and the presentation of special effects. And I think even though some of the techniques are out of date at this point, I don't know that there is a better example of stop motion animation and many other effects still in existence. It also has added a piece to popular culture, an indelible piece of popular culture. The character of King Kong is ubiquitous now, and it never existed prior to the movie. Most other great film monsters come from literature or legend. Kong was wholly invented for the cinema and has become a piece of American and world culture all off of this one movie. So I think that's another reason that it's definitely worthy of being celebrated.
Yeah, these are all good answers, and we could go on for infinity to talk about with platitudes and accolades why Kong is deserving of merit and recognition. Totally agree. I mean, while the visual effects, Ray, they can seem somewhat antiquated today, I think Kong serves as a constant reminder to filmmakers and viewers alike that, imagination, creativity, ingenuity, talent, cinematic audacity, spectacle, these things can create a lasting work of pop art that deserves to be continually appreciated by new generations. I mean, nothing like Kong existed before it. There were some, things like The Lost World by Willis O'Brien, for example. But really, in terms of the scope, the characters, the level of craftsmanship, nothing like Kong existed before. And then the countless copycats, the homages, the remakes, reboots, the derivative works in its wake, I think they speak volumes about the pervasive reach and impact of this 1933 classic, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it invented the giant monster movie.
Exactly.
I don't think there's been a film since in that genre that didn't either take from or was influenced by Kong in some way, shape, or form. The other thing that's sort of extraordinary about it is, it is often referred to that the visual effects are antiquated, as you were saying. And yes, they do come out of a much earlier era, and there are, in some ways, things that we do now that perhaps are more visually convincing. But the thing that's so extraordinary about Kong that I don't know was ever achieved by any other stop motion film, but even a lot of the visual effects today, is that animation, as crude as it may look in some respects, has personality. Even The Lost World, done by roughly the same special effects team, the creatures are impressive.
Mm-hmm.
But Kong has a life, has a personality,
Oh,
and
yeah.
that all comes out of an 18-inch tall puppet. Pretty amazing even to this day.
Yeah, no, that's well said, and I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, you mentioned, this is the progenitor of the giant monster movie, which still, I mean, today, like it commands the box office. We get plenty of these kinds of movies today, of course. But I would go even further. I mean, I think this film essentially created two subgenres: the giant monster film and the fantasy/horror epic, if you will, because what's popular in cinematic entertainment today, it's the superhero movies, it's giant monster films, but it's fantasy / with some horror and adventure elements in it, and the Lord of the Rings movies, things of that nature. I get it. They're different in terms of the stories and the characters, but just in terms of the imaginary, the fantastical elements, the larger-than-life creatures in some of these films, they all owe a debt to Kong, in my opinion. And I think it also debuted a transcendent horror and fantasy character, one that continues to be reinvented by filmmakers and reintroduced but to new audiences. I would go so far to say that only Godzilla is as ubiquitous a mammoth monster in pop culture, which helps explain the recurrent fascination with pitting these two giant creatures against each other in a handful of recent films, right? So,
Yes.
Godzilla is a biggie too, and I'm not trying to say one is bigger or better than the other, but Kong came first, and it says a lot about its transcendence in pop culture.
Kong and Godzilla are different in that Kong in a way has sort of this mythological tragedy to it.
Mm-hmm.
Godzilla in his best films is a force of nature. It's sort of like it's a warning kind of film, whereas Kong is a tragic myth. but both why they're both so fascinating,
Totally. I was watching, taking a deep dive into the DVD/Blu-ray of King Kong by Warner Brothers, put out about 18 years ago or so. Recently watching a lot of those bonus features, and I was really taken by what filmmaker Peter Jackson said about Kong. I'm just paraphrasing here, but he said it's really the first time visual effects would drive the story in a feature film, and that's a powerful statement if you really think about it, because the main character is not even a human being, a flesh and blood creature. It's an 18-inch animated puppet. That's
yes.
Something you could take for granted today, but in 1933, that would have been just mind-boggling to people to think about that. We've come a long way in 90 years, but I think it still holds up for all of the reasons we talked about. But also, I think it's worthy of accolades, 9 decades later, because Kong elevated the stature and the importance and the recognition of special effects artists, right, including Willis O'Brien. And this is a guy who wasn't exactly a household name after Kong. He didn't get his due in his own time until later in his life, from what I understand. But history has shown a stronger light on his name and the talents in the years and decades following. So with O'Brien, in his wake, you get Ray Harryhausen. He achieves even greater fame and attention. And these two influenced a whole new generation of effects wizards, including Phil Tippett, Stan Winston, Douglas Trumbull, John Dykstra, Dennis Murin, Kenneth Ralston. The list goes on. So,
Yes.
Again, it all starts really from Kong and Willis O'Brien, and that's a wonderful lineage to trace.
Absolutely. I mean, you have films prior to Kong that had pieces of all of that. You have Metropolis, The Lost World, films that used visual effects in very sort of startlingly original ways. O'Brien was the first person, in my opinion, who put them all together in one place, because Kong is not just revolutionary for the stop motion animation effects. That is the most notable piece. It's also the first film that really made use of the optical printer.
That's right.
Matte, traveling mats and matte paintings and glass paintings and all sorts of combination things. It was the first film that did it all sort of under one umbrella, under one person. O'Brien was the supervisor on it. And again, created personality out of these effects.
Yes.
In previous films, they were, designed to give you settings and locations. I mean, Metropolis is certainly that kind of film. And in the Lost World, it brings to life the dinosaurs, which is exciting. But Kong's the first one that focused all of that on a single character that had a characterization and made it obviously so memorable.
Yes, well articulated, absolutely. And I want to get into more of the first of its kinds, influences, things like that in the next question. I just want to finish this thought in terms of really giving proper due to why this movie is deserving of kudos 90 years later. I want to just interject here that you think about how Kong brings needed cachet and kudos to the horror and fantasy genres. Now, many of these types of genre films are often devalued by critics and scholars as perhaps lesser entertainment, throwaway pop culture stuff. But if you really look at Kong, I mean, it's been ranked as the greatest horror movie of all time by Rotten Tomatoes at some point in that website's history. It places number 41 in the American Film Institute's list of the 100 greatest American films of all time. It's widely considered the finest monster movie and giant creature film ever made. The list goes on. So you ruminate on how Kong contemporized horror by placing the setting in a modern, thriving metropolis with skyscrapers, right? Not in a Gothic European landscape where old school monsters tend to dwell. The story, it's an original. It's a fresh horror narrative, not sourced from popular genre books like Frankenstein or Dracula or works by Poe or H.G. Wells or anything like that. So this is an American original. Kong also expanded and popularized the Lost World and jungle adventure kind of fare that was explored in previous pictures like, we said, The Lost World. That was 1925. Then you have Cooper and Shudstack's Chang from 1927. And just to kind of trace the path here, next you have a film like Ingagi in 1931. There's a movie called Trader Horn from 31, same year. Next year, you have Tarzan the Ape Man, and then also that year, The Most Dangerous Game. So many of these stories originated from esteemed authors like, Jules Verne, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Arthur Conan Doyle. but not Kong, right? I mean, it's just so interesting to kind of look closely at the pedigree here and how it was furthering and advancing this kind of Lost World and jungle adventure type of genre, if you will.
Obviously, the prime mover behind Kong is Kong's creator, Marion Cooper,
Mm-hmm.
and the world in which all of those films existed was a world that he grew up in which there was still a lot of exploration. There was a lot of the world that was undiscovered or unexplored. So that was in the air, and that's why I think so many of those stories and those films resonated with people. That was a thing that was happening, a world they all were formed in. And Cooper took all those elements, and obviously Kong is influenced by many things. There's lots of pieces of other kinds of films and novels and things that you can find in there.
Certainly.
But he synthesized it all into, really, all those other stories are adventure tales. He synthesized it into a mythological story. And I think anytime you do that, the character becomes mythological, but so does the settings and the trappings. So I think it certainly took all of that to a level it had never been before.
This would have been a graphically violent, sexually suggestive, and disturbing movie for early 1930s audiences, right? Let's not forget, King Kong is a horror movie, and it's bones. I mean, there's a monster.
Yes.
It has a high body count, especially, victims trampled on, bitten, dropped from tall heights, slaughtered by giant creatures.
Mm-hmm.
We see dinosaurs shed blood. Kong cracks open the jaw of one of his vanquished foes and plays with it. Fay Wray's feminine form, how can I say this daintily? It peeks through her garments. She's partially nude, if you look closely, in the swimming escape scene. Mm-hmm. There's the scene where Kong peels off some of Anne's clothing and smells his fingers afterward. So many of these scenes were truncated or excised from later prints by censors. And that tells you that it really would have been a cage-rattling kind of groundbreaking film just in terms of the adult content for early 1930s. And this picture, looking at it closely, it contains some of the most memorable screams in horror film history. Fay Wray's piercing shrieks and convincing howls for help. Right, Ray? I mean, they continue to unnerve modern audiences. She really has a set of pipes on her.
She sure does. All done within the same recording session, too.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, and they show up in a lot of other movies when it's not just Fay Wray anymore either. So that's
true. The movie also, Ray, it avoids taking shortcuts to get to the crowd-pleasing elements, right? Because Kong, he doesn't even appear until about the midway mark, about 47 minutes in.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And that means what? That means audiences are given a solid setup, decent character development before that titular character emerges. And that's the formula that Spielberg is famous for. You don't see the shark until about halfway through, or the aliens kind of showing their presence, if you will, about halfway through in some of his movies. And it's kind of a winning formula, because if you show your hand with the monsters right up front, it's looking like crass commercialism. It's looking like they're just punching a ticket to a higher box office or something, as maybe Son of Kong would demonstrate later that same year. But so I think they do it right in terms of that build up to the monster too.
Cooper did that on purpose, and I think it's a really kind of a brilliant idea. He did it for two reasons. He wanted to get all of the exposition out of the way, so that once Kong came on screen, the movie was going to go nonstop.
Exactly.
And in order to do that, you got to do the setup. The other thing is the slow build-up creates an awful lot of suspense. So by the time Kong actually arrives on the scene, you're so waiting for it that he can't help but make a spectacular impression. And so it was a really smart piece of story construction. The interesting thing is a lot of modern films, I don't know if they don't have the patience for it anymore, or whether the filmmakers think they don't have the patience for it anymore. Because now I'm thinking of the one that came out a few years ago, Kong Skull Island. Kong literally shows up on screen in the first, minute and a half or 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Because I don't think they feel audiences can wait for that anymore. But it takes so much of the impact away again, bowing to really how smart Cooper was about conceiving.
Yeah, I recall how Peter Jackson approached his remake in 2005, and I actually thought it took longer,
Yes.
maybe a little too long to get to the island. Like there was a
Yeah.
little too much build-up and exposition, maybe some unnecessary characters. It's still a fantastic film and a great remake for my money. But to your point, like today, things have changed dramatically. Audiences have perhaps less patience. Their attention span is perhaps lesser, or maybe it's just the fact that, as you were saying, filmmakers just don't trust that they're going to sit patiently through the build-up, and they want to give them the good stuff right up front. But Kong here from 33, it demonstrates that for a long, long, long time, this was the formula for a great monster movie.
Yes.
You don't roll him out until at least about the midway point or so. And it also makes economic sense, right? Because it takes forever for Willis O'Brien and his team to shoot these stop-motion images and set them up. I mean, if you go through the bonus features on the Kong DVD, I highly recommend it. They actually show you how the processes were done and how these different, like you said, effects were combined in a unique way for the first time. Very creative, very original and ingenious, some of these techniques, but they took painstaking amounts of time. Yeah, so you couldn't have, wall-to-wall giant monsters in 1933. It just, it would have bankrupted the studio and probably sent Willis O'Brien to an early grave. So it is what it is, and I think it works very well. My last point here, before we transition to maybe some other influences, what's interesting is Kong deserves to be celebrated as a metafilm too, Ray, because it's kind of a movie about the making of a movie,
yes,
and also about its makers. Because if you recall, Carl Denham is attempting to film this exotic adventure film starring Ann Darrow, and King Kong also reflects the adventurous backstory and sensibilities of its co-director, co-producer Marion C. Cooper, who was, from what I learned here, he was famous for being one of the first bomber pilots in World War I, for exploring exotic locations and filming documentaries and fictional movies in faraway lands like Africa, Iran, Thailand, that often featured dangerous wild animals, ferocious warriors, nomadic tribes, and indigenous people. So Kong is somewhat of a reflection, especially in the Denham character, of one of its co-creators.
It's actually of three of its creators, because Carl Denham is very definitely based on Marion Cooper.
Mm-hmm.
There's a great line where someone says, they make some comment about him, is he dangerous or whatever, and someone says, no, just enthusiastic, which I think is probably the best description of Cooper.
Fitting.
He was an enthusiastic explorer. He was an enthusiastic filmmaker. He, of course, also was enthusiastic about aviation and co-created Pan American Airlines. He just threw himself in anything he did, and that is the characterization of Carl Denham. The interesting part is in all of the remakes and other versions of Kong, the role that Denham plays in the story is always characterized as the villain. And Carl Denham is not the villain of King Kong. His enthusiasm may cause a lot of trouble, but the movie sees him heroically because he was based on Cooper. Jack Driscoll was based very much on Ernest Chodzak, the co-director of the film.
Yeah, this is true.
A taciturn man, a quieter guy, a guy a little bit more, going to hang back in reserve. And then Ann Darrow has a lot of the characteristics of Chodzak's wife, Ruth Rose, who wrote the final shooting draft for Kong.
That's right.
You're right. Yeah, which is why they all reflect that. And one of the things Cooper had said to her when she was writing was, make it have the spirit of our adventures. So many of the stories that are told as sort of color in the film are things that actually happened to Cooper and Chodzak. The story about the cameraman who, ran off and got scared and, going up to a lion and telling it to look pleasant, finding a girl at the last minute. That actually happened to their friend, I believe it was Steve Clemente.
So interesting.
Yeah, like all of those little color things come from actual things they experienced.
It's great. They tell writers, write what you know, and filmmakers, hey, film what you know, right?
Exactly.
I mean, infuse your own backstory somehow, if you can, creatively into a narrative, and that works here. And also into the characterization, as you were saying, like with Anne from the screenwriter. But also, you could make a case that there's a fourth filmmaker that is mirrored in Kong, and that's of course Willis O'Brien, because in the documentary, you learn that so much of his own personality is infused in this giant creature, or in this case, an 18-inch puppet. Most of us know very little about Willis O'Brien. He didn't give a lot of interviews, or he was kind of a mysterious, quiet figure, but you have to trust that, he really did kind of imbue some of his own, idiosyncrasies and personality into that character.
A lot of the people who knew him and watched the film said Kong is Willis O'Brien. It's his personality. O'Brien was a big boxing fan, and someone said if you watch Kong when he fights the Allosaurus, that he's fighting by official boxing rules, because that's and people have said that the part where he plays with the jaw of the dead Allosaurus, that was O'Brien's humor.
Apparently, O'Brien was a bit of a wrestling fan too,
yes,
right?
He was.
Because he pulls a move on that Allosaurus that's right out of WWF.
He sure does. And Kong has kind of this quizzical aspect to him from time to time, and people said it was all very much a reflection of O'Brien. So you're right. There are 4 filmmakers represent the film.
That's really, really cool. This is a nice transition to delve a bit, Ray, into how this movie was innovative and influential for 1933, or for that matter, the first of its kind in any way.
Yeah.
So let's get into this a little bit deeper. When you ponder the influence Kong has had on cinema, you've already said it, right? I mean, by proving and inventively combining different special effects and techniques in one film, you have something really unique here. I mean, the stop-motion animation, the miniatures, the rear projection used, optical printing for the first time, at least in this context, models, matte paintings. It all revolutionized the field and raised the bar for visual and audio effects. And then you also have to think about the audio design, the sound design. Murray Spivak, who's responsible for the sound effects, what does he do? He combines different animal noises, slowly played backward, to create Kong's distinctive roar, and he employed, from what I learned, an air compressor and his own vocals to produce many of the dinosaur sounds. What did you learn in writing the book? And just, if you want to summarize, if you will, why the combination of all these techniques were so important here?
Well, the film couldn't exist without all of these innovations that had happened kind of right around the same time. But you're right. So taking it as a film itself, it is the blueprint for the giant monster movie. So from a creative genre respect, it's a pioneer. It is a pioneer in visual effects. These techniques were invented or perfected for Kong and used in combination. The unsung hero of Kong is a name you don't hear much outside of the industry, a man named Linwood Dunn.
That's right.
And Linwood Dunn was RKO's optical effects supervisor, and he's the one who he didn't invent the optical printer, but he perfected it, and he persuaded Cooper. What a lot of people don't realize is the film was halfway through production before the optical printer was ready to go, and he convinced Cooper to make use of it. Before that, they were using a process called the Dunning process, which was a way of combining footage on the same piece of film that was a lot more precarious, a lot more hit and miss. There was a process called the Dunning process, which is in the early parts of the film. That Williams was actually the guy who really pioneered the traveling matte, and then Linwood Dunn is the guy who figured out how to sort of do that more practically on the optical printer in kind of an assembly line fashion, which is what allowed Kong to actually get finished, because otherwise they might still be trying to get all the footage.
90 years later, right?
Yeah, so it's a landmark in all of and almost every technique used in Kong continued to be used, sometimes refined, sometimes updated, up until the beginning of the CGI revolution.
It's amazing. Yeah. It's incredible, the lasting influence of that and how those techniques and processes persisted for generations.
Exactly.
I was going to ask you to walk us through how each of these processes works, but it's too difficult. Yeah. You have to see it. It's demonstrated so effectively in the bonus features. There's a whole chapter on the long-form documentary of the making of Kong. Highly, highly recommend, because they'll actually show you each of the techniques and the nitty-gritty technical aspects of how it was done and how they recreated it. Peter Jackson and his team actually attempted to recreate how they were done in the 21st century, and it is absolutely fascinating. So check that out, listeners. We don't want to waste your time with trying to describe all of this stuff. It does get a little bit complicated.
To keep it brief and summarize it, it's basically a way of taking There are many ways of taking separately photographed images and combining them into one frame of film. And that was necessary if you're going to have an 18-inch puppet be alongside a regular sized person and make that puppet seem gigantic. And you're right, those special features will give you a much more detailed look.
Yeah, there's also some great stuff on YouTube you can look up.
Yes.
But I think the process you're talking about in general is compositing,
Compositing,
right? Creating
right.
composite images.
Optical compositing. And there's many ways to go about it. Kong has all of them in it. And the Dunning process stopped being used a little bit after. The only thing Kong doesn't have is blue screen, because blue screen was developed for color, and obviously Kong is a black and white film. Blue screen made it 10 times more complicated, and that came a few years later.
Right.
The other place Kong is revolutionary, you already alluded to it, is in the sound effects.
Yes.
The Lost World had come out a few years before, but was a silent film. Kong was the first sound picture that really needed fully created sound effects from beginning to end, because without sound effects, the Kong scenes don't come alive. Because the stop motion is great, but it's silent. And in order for that to be persuasive, you needed, and obviously the dinosaurs, but Kong needed a voice, recognizable sounds. And, you're talking about a transition time. Early sound in films mostly had to be recorded on the set. There was not an ability to really do sort of post-production recording and incorporating it into a print. Kong came along right when they were figuring out how to do that. But even then, it was still very primitive. So Spivak was very influential in creating all the different sounds for the film, but he also was innovative in getting them integrated into the film. He was not necessarily the pioneer of every specific process, but it's the first film that put it all together in that way. And now that's how we do it. Most films, all of the sound effects tend to come later. That was not the case back when they were putting Kong together.
So interesting.
Yeah. The other thing the film is quite notable for is obviously we had just transitioned to sound. Films had musical soundtracks, music, playing along. But in the early sound days, all of that had to be done on set while they were filming. Then they got to the point where they were able to record a score afterwards and integrate it into the film, but again, not very smoothly. So music was used very sparingly in early sound pictures. Max Steiner comes along, and again, they need pretty much wall-to-wall music to bring the piece to life. So it isn't the first score done for a sound picture, but it is the first one that really the entire picture was carried by it. It's the first extensive score for a sound picture.
Now, I looked this up. Tell me if you found otherwise, but from what I understand, it's the first feature-length Hollywood talkie to be graced with a musical score written specifically for it.
The only place I would deviate it is that the film that actually precedes it, that was also a Cooper Showtime production, was a film called The Most Dangerous Game.
Right.
And basically everybody who worked on Kong worked on Most Dangerous Game.
Including Steiner?
Steiner did write the score for Most Dangerous Game.
There you go.
Yeah. But that score was put together for that film, and it came out a little bit ahead of Kong.
Okay.
But it's not extensive in the way that Steiner's score for Kong is.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it is a groundbreaking, pioneering score for all the reasons you mentioned. And when you just think about the quality of the score, I mean, this isn't like some throwaway, musical interlude or something. There's actually an overture that properly introduces the picture now on home video. But again, you think of just all the different leitmotifs and the themes written. Everything is matched really, really well. It doesn't seem like some quickie throwaway score.
Well, famously, the studio did not want to pay for the score, because what is a little bit lost to time and is sometimes a little frustrating to read is, because the film is in black and white and because it is a horror monster movie, it is often referred to like as a B picture. And the thing is, Kong was not a B picture. Kong actually cost at the time double the average cost of the average A picture.
Oh, I'll bet.
Yeah, and it ran over its budget because special effects movies always do that. And so the studio was like, we don't just throw together a score, just use pieces of other scores, and we'll go ahead and we'll do that. And Cooper actually said, no, it needs to be original. So he told Max Steiner, you go ahead and you write an original score and you put together the orchestra and record it, and I will pay for it out of my own pocket, which he did initially. RKO did reimburse him for it. But and like with every other instinct Cooper had, he was correct.
Yeah, good instincts.
But the other key thing that is unique in that film is that Spivak and Steiner worked together so that the pitch and the levels of the score went harmoniously together with the sound effects, so that, like, if they had been done in different ranges, you would have had a cacophony of noise. They had to figure out how to put all of the levels of sound. I'm not a sound expert, but all of the different levels and pitches together, so it all integrated.
That makes sense.
So it's revolutionary in that respect as well, because that's pretty much how we handle sound and score now. But that was the first film that really did that.
Yeah, absolutely. Kong himself has remained debatably, arguably, the most famous, instantly recognizable movie monster in history. I know you have Frankenstein, you have some other contenders to that crown, but at least giant monsters and monsters in general, this guy could remain the monarch of that title. And
yes.
You think about the popularity of video games like Donkey Kong. I remember playing a video game called Rampage in which these giant monsters would scale the sides of buildings. I mean, it's so pervasive in pop culture, and it speaks to the enduring influence of a giant ape as a crowd-pleasing character.
Right.
Kong stands as the first animated leading character to be a hit for a Hollywood studio. To me, that's no small point, because this colossal ape is infused, as we said, with personality. He's sympathetic. He's entrancing as a larger-than-life character. It became huge on its re-releases as well. In 1952, in particular, that reissue catalyzed the giant monster movie craze of the 1950s, including the debut of Godzilla in 1954 and the subsequent Japanese kaiju pictures like Mothra and some of the others. Among the imitators and the coattail riders in the years after Kong's 1933 debut are things like Dr. Cyclops from 1940, White Pongo from 1945, and then you have, Mighty Joe Young from 1949. Konga is 1961. You have Kong Island, 1968. Some of these are very dubious just in their titles and their special effects, but again, it shows, kind of what came in its wake. And then there was Son of Kong, released the same year. In the 60s, we got King Kong vs. Godzilla and King Kong Escapes. There was the first direct remake in 1976, right? Peter Jackson's acclaimed 2005 remake was of course, very popular. And then you mentioned, Kong Skull Island from 2017. That rebooted the character. And most recently, you have the sequel to that film, Godzilla vs. Kong. And from what I understand, there's even a sequel to that in the works. So all of this just proves that this guy isn't going away anytime soon. He's still very, very popular.
Absolutely. He's also one of those characters, maybe arguably Frankenstein and Dracula are the same, where there are generations of people who have never seen these films who know who those characters are.
Oh, sure.
Every person in the world knows who King Kong is, even if they've not seen the picture.
And also, Kong wasn't the first live-action Hollywood film to use animated dinosaur characters, but it can likely be credited with motivating future filmmakers to make fantastical features showcasing dinosaurs. Kong boasts several memorable dinosaur battles, and some of these aren't technically dinosaurs, these creatures, but they're close approximations. So in Kong's wake came memorable prehistoric creatures in Fantasia from 1940, the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms in the 50s, 1 million years BC, the Valley of Gwangi, When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth, The Land That Time Forgot, and of course the Jurassic Park films of today. So it's no small point, right, Ray, that there were things like The Lost World and some dinosaur representations on the big screen before Kong. But really, this is the movie that kind of cements in the public's imagination, like, wow, the creativity with which filmmakers can explore this, putting dinosaurs on canvas and maybe intermingling them with fictional creatures, too.
Yes. Yeah, you never underestimate the power of a hit, right? Like, the film was such a big hit and an influential hit that people wanted more. And obviously, both from a producer point of view, where you want to give the audiences more, and from an influence point of view, where this whole new generation of people were inspired by it, you're just going to keep popularizing the giant monster trend from that time till now, 90 years. So yeah, very influential in that way.
No question. Okay, I have to bring this up just for this in the sake of fairness here, and I'm not trying to pick on the film. It's easy to play armchair quarterback, but let's briefly explore, Ray, maybe some elements that aren't so evergreen, maybe that appear dated and problematic 9 decades on. Now, we can agree some of the special effects look a little dated today. We've talked about that, okay? But what else? Let's talk about maybe some of the racial or gender representations, if you will.
Right. Well, the most obvious is the racial aspects of the tribe of natives on Kong's Island, which were, I mean, there's an interesting thing there, but it's a little tricky. Clearly, they're portrayed as primitive people,
right,
probably backwards people, not the most, a little bit stereotypical of a time when African Americans were thought of in a lesser light. So it certainly has those aspects to it. There's a couple of lines in the movie regarding that, which could be better. You know, blondes are scarce around here, things like that. Right. The interesting part of it, but I don't think it really carries that much weight, is that because Cooper and Schoedsack and Ruth Rose had done a lot of exploring in that part of the world, they actually tried to make that the tribe like have its own sort of culture, so that it kind of made an internal sense.
Okay.
But I think it does in certain ways, but it still doesn't get away from kind of the stereotypical presentation of things. So that's probably the biggest element. The other thing is it is a view of women that existed back then, you know, which is, although the Jack Driscoll character who voices it the most, you know, women are a nuisance and they can't help but being a bother and all that. Like, the film is not necessarily on his side, but it certainly expresses, you know, probably a fairly common attitude. And as has been pointed out by others and by me in other areas, Anne doesn't have much of a character. Like, she's quite appealing in the early scenes where she does have a character, the struggling actress. Pretty much once Kong shows up, all she does is scream.
Yeah, she's a damsel in distress. She has no agency. I mean, it's unfortunate all these years later, but for 1933, she's playing exactly what audiences would expect of this type of character.
Right.
That may sound harsh in 2023, but that's the truth. This is what would have been expected of this kind of character. I'm not saying of the actress, but of the character and the way it's written. It is what it is. It's a relic of its time.
Yes, very much so. And that's probably where it's the most dated, in those two areas. Mm-hmm. I did have an interesting experience. They did a screening of it a few years back, and I took a relative, a young person, and they had a lot of trouble with the slang. They didn't understand what he was saying in the movie, and especially in the first part. And so some of the slang is pretty outdated too, but that's not as big an issue as the other two.
And to me, I mean, what stood out on this most recent rewatch, Ray, some of the acting is, let's just call it ham-tastic from time to time. Mm-hmm. The dialogue can sometimes be a bit trite and groan-worthy. You think of Driscoll suddenly telling Anne with the most unenthusiastic delivery imaginable, "Hey, I guess I love you." Yeah, I don't know. It just, it's a bit creaky.
It is of its day.
Exactly. So nobody was nominated for any acting Oscars. That's fair to say.
No, but the acting too, like we forget now, but acting underwent a huge revolution in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Oh, sure.
Where realism became the key to acting. That was not the case back then. Theatrical was the way people acted. I would say in the bigness of it all, Robert Armstrong. What's interesting when you watch Fay Wray is Fay Wray did most of her major work in silent movies, and there are moments where she's giving a silent movie performance. Her gestures, her facial expressions are very much of that genre. The thing about Bruce Cabot, and you know, not to be too harsh, but I just don't think he was a particularly good actor. So I think that's where you get some of that from.
Yeah, it's debatable. I tend to agree. I can't really compare him to anything that I think I can recall him being in.
He was not the first choice. It was Joel McCrea.
That's right, from The Most Dangerous Game.
Yes. The most affordable, actually.
Exactly, yeah. You got to cut corners somewhere. Not in the special effects, thankfully, but maybe some of the other areas. Sure. But it's okay.
Sure.
So let's talk a bit about themes or messages or morals to the story. So what would you say say stands out as far as a message from Kong? I mean, there's some really obvious ones, but let's just hash it out briefly.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting topic, and I'll try to keep it brief because Marion Cooper himself rejected any message interpretation of the film other than the obvious one, which was Beauty and the Beast. And it's actually not Beauty and the Beast. It's really more like
Beauty killed the beast.
Beauty killed the beast. Beauty
Yeah.
and the Beast is the beauty finds the heart in the beast. Here it's the beast is brought down. So it's a little bit more like a Samson kind of thing. But I think that part of it is the strongest. Obviously, there are, you can make an analogy to colonialism, to exploitation of natural resources, to exploitation of peoples. There have been slavery interpretations of it,
Yeah.
the slave breaking the chains and striking back against the master. I mean, you can see it in all those lights if you choose to. There's also sort of there's been an economic interpretation. The people who have been brought down by the powers that be striking back, because the film was made in the middle of the Depression. So I've read interpretations that go along that way. There's also a communist interpretation of it, which is the masses rise up and overthrow the capitalists and things. It's the sign of a good elemental story that you can read into it many, many different things.
True. Yeah. As you said, the filmmakers may not have intended any of this stuff, but it's okay. You can draw your own conclusions. You can interpret a work of art however you choose.
Yes.
And I think where there's smoke, there's fire here because, to your point, this is a man versus nature story. It's the attempt to take advantage of and profit from the natural world and vulnerable populations. Kong today works perhaps as a scathing critique of the so-called civilized white man's hubris in attempting to conquer the unconquered, plunder the planet's natural resources, and capitalize on our instinctive enthrallment with never-before-seen, wild, untamed, captured creatures, right? In this story, nature gets its revenge for a while by wreaking havoc upon civilization, but then it's the dominant species, Homo sapien, that ultimately prevails. I want to read you real quickly. This is critic Richard Scheib, who said that in Kong, civilization corrupts the greatness of the jungle beast. So Kong was a proud and mighty king in his native land, but man remains monarch of the developed world. I think we can surmise here.
Sure. What I think is so interesting about I always think of it in terms of myth. I don't know that I'm fairly certain Cooper did not set out to make it mythological, but one of the great things I think about B movies and genre films, and one of the reasons why I think they tend to last longer than, let's say, more straightforward dramas and things, is that they tap into these elemental, if you want to get all Jungian about it, all the universal myths, all the archetypes that matter to us. And Kong has so much of that in its DNA that I think it allows you to create all these different interpretations because there's just something so elemental about its story pieces.
Yeah, no question. Yeah, that's very well put. But just to kind of real briefly open that door on Beauty Killed the Beast as a possible theme, Kong succumbs to his attackers because he tries to protect Anne from getting hurt by the planes. He's distracted by this goal while he's atop the Empire State Building, right?
Yes.
Ultimately, the animal's human-like emotional attachment to Anne proves his undoing.
Yep.
This theme can also be construed, however, as sexist or misogynistic if you conclude that Anne's feminine allure, her appeal to Kong, had the power to inadvertently slay a creature imbued with hypermasculine and patriarchal qualities. So it's just an interesting read, and if that's intended, well, then on the other hand, it doesn't make Anne look very good either. So through the prism of a 2023 lens, I mean, it's easy to poke holes in some of these themes or to kind of question if they were the motivations of the filmmakers, what have you. That's going to be the case with a lot of older films, of course, but it's fun. To me, I really enjoy digging into the themes a bit here.
Sure. And what's always fascinating to me about this is you can look back at a time where attitudes and ideas were very different than ours.
Oh, sure.
And I think it's so you can judge how far we've come. You can judge in some places how far we haven't come. But it's an interesting window. I mean, it's a period piece in a way it was never intended to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think it is fair game just to kind of look under the microscope a bit in terms of the theme of Beauty and the Beast, not just killed the beast.
Yeah.
I mean, Kong is a loose reflection of this myth, but this reading, Ray, it only serves as a superficial one, I would argue,
Yeah.
because it's not a retelling of the French fairy tale that was published in, the 1700s. Instead, the film clearly juxtaposes an attractive but helpless female with this gargantuan monstrosity whose affection for and devotion to her is unrequited. Yeah, Beauty and the Beast, it's kind of there in the DNA. It's an obvious comparison that you would think of firsthand, but it's more, as we were saying, maybe Beauty killed the Beast.
Yes, yeah.
And that's what Denham says at the end, too. So
Right.
it's interesting how that's an oft misquoted line as well.
And it's also in the totally invented old Arabian proverb at the beginning of the film.
Yeah, that's made out of whole cloth, right? I
Absolutely.
mean, that doesn't exist.
but that theme is really what the picture is that it is the beast, the king of the island. As soon as he softens his heart, he's dead.
That's right.
And you can, whatever masculine or patriarchal idea you want to read into that is there. It also is maybe a slightly cynical view of us being soft in any way, but I think that's what Cooper was going for, I think.
No, it's well put. I totally agree. We are hosting a podcast birthday party this month for that emperor of enormous entities, King Kong, and it's fitting to give presents on birthdays, right, Ray? Only it's the fans who continue to get the gifts. Ray, what is King Kong's greatest gift to viewers?
Absolutely iconic pop culture character that only grows in stature as each year goes on.
Yeah, you can't say it much better than that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, speaks for itself.
That's its biggest gift. The other thing is it remains, I think, a really, really wonderful movie. All of the great fantasy and science fiction films, especially ones based around special effects, are created by people inspired by this movie. So I don't think you get any of those movies in the way that we know them without this film. So it's really given us all of those genre things in the years that followed,
Ray, you can make an argument that the 1933 iteration of King Kong, despite its flaws, and again, special effects many would find quaint today, bouts of mediocre acting, if you see it that way, which I kind of do, occasionally campy dialogue, all of those things understood. Nevertheless, King Kong remains quite possibly, to me anyway, the most seminal and momentous cinematic text of the 20th century. Why? Kind of like the massive gate on Skull Island that Kong busts through, right? It opens this doorway to a whole new stratum of larger-than-life entertainment that each subsequent generation since has increasingly demanded, right? The fantasy, horror, adventure epic, a subset of which is the giant monster movie, which we discussed at length earlier. You consider the extent to which such genre fare rules the box office today. Most of the stuff that passes for popular entertainment, and again, superhero movies kind of meld into this too, falls under this umbrella. So if you were to trace back, where did this come from? You have to look specifically at the 1933 King Kong, which proved that extraordinary visions of imaginative fancy could be effectively conjured, right? I mean, that mythical and historical beasts alike could come alive and intermingle with live-action human beings. That was a radical concept back in the early 30s. And couple that with a narrative that's wonderfully punctuated by riveting action sequences. Once Kong appears, all the setup, all the character development, all the exposition is out the window. And now it's just chase and action time. And fights with gigantic monsters. And again, in my own lifetime, I'm only in my mid-50s, right? I remember being a kid, and so many boys and girls for that matter, of my generation and thereabouts recall seeing on television the showings of King Kong around, Thanksgiving and on Saturday afternoons and things like that, even chopped up as a after-school movie on a local television station where they'd cut out half the film, but they'd fit it in. We all recall, I'm sure you probably do too, right? Where this still passed as acceptable in terms of the animation and the special effects, everything. We didn't think, this is really old and creaky. I can only speak for myself, I know, but it just totally captured my imagination. And this is what you were talking about in terms of inspiring the whole new generation of filmmakers and special effects artists. So Kong's mammoth movie footprints were felt everywhere in the years that followed, from the exotic adventures of, The Thief of Baghdad in 1940, right, to the great run of Ray Harryhausen movies that began in the 50s, the Toho cycle of Godzilla and kaiju films launched in the mid-50s. I even think of the Star Wars franchise. I know it's a loose association, but the battle in the trenches of the Death Star at the end of New Hope, to me, it feels somewhat like the climb to the Empire State Building with the biplanes. It just has some of the same DNA. And then, of course, the Jurassic Park films come to mind. And all of this circles back to the new big screen Kong creations made over the last 18 years since Peter Jackson kind of reinvented this. So any contemporary film, Ray, with dinosaurs, with supersized animals, with colossal creatures, horrific antagonists that wreak mass destruction upon a teeming metropolis, or for that matter, any voyages to mysterious realms where fantastic forces and astounding organisms dwell, they all owe a giant debt to the original King Kong, and I would call that a gargantuan gift. So that, to me, that's the greatest gift, and it's in tandem with what you said.
Yeah, I like what you said. It's right on point. I think you can't make a movie in those genres without reckoning with Kong in some way or another. You know, and what I love is in the Spielberg Jurassic Park movies, at least, he's always paying homage to Kong, like with on-screen references, the gates in the original Jurassic Park.
Even the second one is kind of a loose remake, narratively, of King Kong.
Yes. Yeah. Well, Spielberg famously said, I guess originally that film was only set on the island. He said, well, there'll be a third film and we'll bring the dinosaurs to civilization, but he knew he wasn't going to make a third one. So he said, I want to do a monster movie where the monsters run amok in civilization. So they kind of tack that whole ending on. But if you look at the name of the boat that brings the dinosaur to land, it's the Venture.
There you go.
Which is the name of the boat in King Kong as well.
Absolutely. So what's up next for Ray Morton? Are there any current or forthcoming projects, books, events you'd like to tell us about?
Currently, if you're interested in Kong and commentaries on later Kong, there are 2 new discs out. Shout Factory put out a Blu-ray of the 1976 King Kong.
Oh yeah, I own it.
Yeah, and I do a commentary on that.
It's great.
And Umbrella Entertainment in Australia just brought out a disc on that film's sequel, King Kong Lives. I also did a commentary on that. So those 2 things are current. And I am actually working on an update of my Kong book because my book came out right before Peter Jackson's film. Obviously, there's been a lot of Kong material since. And plus, I've also continued to do research on the films I've already written about. So I'm going to try to provide an updated version of the book to make it even more complete.
Very cool.
Than it was when it came out back in 2005.
Wow, lots on your plate there. Yeah, I can totally vouch for that Shout Factory reissue of the 1976 King Kong, which still holds a special place in my heart, folks. I mean, I think I was about to turn 8 when that film hit theaters, and boy, I was just enthralled. For a long time, I thought that was the superior picture to 1933. Yes. But then as I got older, I got wiser too.
It's an important film in the Kong legend, though. Like the thing that film, why I think it is a absolutely worthy addition to the Kong canon, is that every Kong film since the original, Kong is a hero. And the relationship between Kong and the girl, depending on who she is in each
she's Dwan in the 76 version.
Right. And that there's a connection between them, and which I think Peter Jackson worked out really, really well in his film.
Oh, sure.
And the thing is that the 70s film is the film where that element was introduced.
Yeah. You know what I think the 76 film does better than than the predecessor or the subsequent version? Tell me if you disagree, is the scenes on the island, especially depicting the natives. I know there's still some creaky representation there. I get it. But it just feels a little bit more authentic to me, the way they filmed it and art direction and all of those kinds of things. In Jackson's version, boy, it really rubs me the wrong way, the way that the natives are represented. And of course, in the original, there's problematic elements there. So it's a small point, but again, it has its charms. Each version of King Kong has its pluses and minuses.
Absolutely.
You know, so, but again, I can also vouch for that. Yeah, your commentary on that disc is fantastic. So keep up that great work. work.
Thank you. The 70s Kong also boasts an absolutely wonderful score by John Barry.
Yes, underrated.
Very underrated. And I think, for my money, in all three versions of the official versions of the story, I think the sacrifice sequence and the introduction of Kong is the best in that version. I think it's just marvelous. Yeah.
It's got a really strong cast,
Yes.
so it's underrated. Probably the least of the three in terms of what critics, historians, scholars, and even some fans consider. But again, don't overlook it. Check it out. Check out all versions of
Yes.
Kong. They all have their merits.
Absolutely.
What do you think of the latest versions, like Kong versus Godzilla and Skull Island and things like that? Are you a fan, or what do you think?
I think they're okay. I think they're not really Kong movies. They are giant monster movies. I really liked in the last one, the Godzilla versus Kong. I thought because to me, a key element in any King Kong picture is got to be his relationship with some human character. Obviously, in the three versions of the main story, it's with the woman who is sacrificed to Kong, be her Anne or be her Dwan. And I feel like that was kind of missing from Kong Skull Island, which I thought was a little bit all over the place. But I thought they came up with a really great idea in Godzilla versus Kong, where the little deaf girl can communicate with Kong through sign language, which is obviously, an extrapolation of the whole Coco the gorilla thing. And I wish they had done more with it in that film. And maybe they will in the film that's coming up. But I thought that was a really great way of doing Kong's connection with a human without it having to be the love story version, which is what it is kind of in the main three films.
So there you go. There's an endorsement for why you might want to check out some of the more recent Kong fare. Ray, is there anywhere where listeners can go to connect with you online or through social media?
They can find me on Instagram at RayMorton1, and I have a website, raymorton.com, and there's a email attachment to that. So if anyone wants to reach me, they can reach me through there.
Fantastic. Well, Ray, I want to thank you again for exploring all of the crevices of Skull Island, if you will, with us here. Thanks again for your time and your expertise and insights on King Kong.
Thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
Wow, Ray covered Kong like an ace biplane pilot, and for that, we share our thanks. And rounding out our trio of interviews, let's roll out the red carpet for a man who has a special place in his heart for old King Kong, Richard Correll. He's worn many hats over his career, including director, writer, producer, and actor, and you probably remember him as young Richard Rickover on the Leave It to Beaver TV show. But you probably didn't know that Richard also has a horror film museum of sorts and has a connection with this month's film, King Kong. Let's give a hearty hello to Richard Correll. Hi, Richard.
Hi, how you doing, Eric?
Oh, I'm doing great. Great to talk to you today. So, Rich, what's your history and relationship with the 1933 King Kong?
Well, I'll make it really brief. It started as just a fan. When I was in third grade, this was 1956. It came on television in Los Angeles. That's where I lived, on a show called $1 Million Movie. And it was on every night of the week and then twice on the weekends each day. I missed it on Monday. And when I came to school, I was a third grader. All my friends were saying, "Oh, did you see King Kong? It's so great." So I watched it the following night. And even as a kid, that thing completely transformed me. I was watching it on a black and white television.
Oh, sure.
It transformed me into this different land. The island, the dinosaurs. It was my kind of thing. It affected me like no other movie had. And even though I was young, I said at the time, okay, that's it. I want to be in show business. I just have to be in show business, because if these guys can make a movie that'll do this, that'll transform me into a different place, then I've got to be in this business. My dad was obviously really entrenched in show business, but that was in radio. But that had nothing to do with it. It was really King Kong. So I kind of looked at this movie as a friend of mine. It became this big thing for all of our schoolmates. When it would come on TV in Los Angeles on the weekends, we'd have parties and get together and watch the movie. And, we were still watching it on television with commercials, and sometimes it wasn't the full length version of it. And then little by little, I got familiar with it. A friend of mine who had a 35 millimeter collection of film in a theater in his house had a beautiful print of it. And it meant a lot to me. And then over the years, I realized how important it was to me. So in 1983, the 50th anniversary of the movie, at that time I was working at Paramount for Gary Marshall. I was working on Laverne and Shirley and Happy Days. And when that came out, when the 50th anniversary came along, I decided to do a tribute to the movie for the Motion Picture Hospital, and that was to produce the 50th anniversary premiere of King Kong and hold it at the Chinese Theater, restage the entire thing. Jim Danforth and Tom Sherman came in and rebuilt the bust and the head and the hand.
Oh, wow.
Had old cars, bring all these celebrities up. We had this roster of celebrities that went on and on and on and on. One of whom was Hugh Hefner, who I met through that, who became one of my best friends for a long time.
Is that right?
But I produced that show for the Motion Picture Hospital. We restaged the whole premiere. We ran the movie at the Chinese Theater. Fay Wray and I hosted the evening, which was thrilling because
amazing.
We had Murray Spivak there. We had Linwood Dunn there. We had Willis O'Brien and Miriam Cooper's widows there.
Wow.
We had at the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel across the street, we did an entire artifacts collection using Forey Ackerman stuff, using Cooper stuff, using Willis O'Brien stuff. It was unbelievable. This thing was so cool. I was so happy to do it. But the best part was I was watching my favorite movie in the theater that it premiered in Los Angeles in 1933, sitting next to Fay Wray, who was the star of the movie.
Incredible.
She and I hosted this. I got to be really good friends with Ernest Schoedsack and Ruth Rose. I got to be good friends with Fay Wray. Never met Cooper because he was kind of ill when the times I was trying to see him. I never met him. But then, Linwood Dunn and, as I said, Murray Spivak and a number of the other people, met Marcel Delgado, tried to get in touch with as many people as possible. When I was a kid and I was acting, one of the shows I did away from Bieber was a show called The Blue Angels, which was about the jet fighters. And in the episode I did, I played a kid that goes up in an airplane with his dad, and then his dad has a heart attack, and then the kid has to land the plane, and the Blue Angels talk the kid down. But in that episode, my best friend was my grandfather, and my grandfather was played by James Flavin, whose first movie was King Kong, where he played Briggs, the first mate.
Oh, okay, that's who he is.
All these connections to King Kong kept coming along and along and along.
Yeah, I think the universe is telling you something, Richard.
Yeah, well, the other thing is, when I was also a kid, I was working on Lassie, and Lassie was shooting at Desilu Gower, which at the time had been RKO. Then it became Desilu Gower, and then it was absorbed by Paramount. John Provost, who was the star of Lassie, who played Timmy, was a great guy. At lunchtime, he and I would wander around, and there was a building there called the RKO Miniature Department. Everything was up there. They had the Pteranodon, they had the T-Rex, they had the Brontosauruses, they had the wall, they had the biplanes, and then they had two boxes marked Kong 1 and 2. As you know, principally, Willis O'Brien only used 2 stop-motion animation figures, and they were 18 inches tall, and I thought, oh my gosh, here's King Kong. He's going to be there in person, because, I had been reading Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine, and I knew all that, the miniatures and all that. So I climbed up on a shelf and opened those boxes, and in the boxes were not King Kong, but Mighty Joe Young.
Oh, okay.
The 12-inch miniatures of Joe were in those boxes, but they were the same boxes used for the King Kong miniatures, which then again turned up later. Bob Burns has one, and Peter Jackson has the other one.
Okay.
Peter Jackson has the short face, and Burns has the long face. So it's just that film became such an important part of my life. Then it revolved around my career. And then all these various things just kept happening about King Kong. And then I was really happy to be somebody who kind of paid tribute to it on its 50th anniversary. And then when Peter Jackson and everybody decided to do all the DVD supplemental materials for the release of it on DVD, then I was one of the guys they interviewed, and I was honored to do that too. Yeah, and then I was in there talking about Ruth Rose and Schoedsack. I used to go visit Ernest Schoedsack. He lived in Santa Monica. And he was a great guy. His whole life was about making tapes and doing audio stuff because he had lost his eyesight. He was primarily blind. But I had a great time with him. And Ruth Rose was a sweetheart, and she was great. Schoedsack was like 6'6", and Ruth Rose was like 5'3".
Opposites attract.
And Cooper was a small guy too. So that was kind of funny. But I mean, talking so much and dealing with the movie with Fay Wray, I've seen this film. I've seen it well over 200 times.
Yeah, amazing.
And
Is it your favorite film, Richard?
Oh, absolutely.
Wow.
It's not only my favorite film, but it's also the film that influenced me more than any other film.
Yeah, what do you love about it? Like when you were a child, obviously it struck you, it mesmerized you, and maybe you were just fascinated with horror or monster movies or what have you, as a lot of young kids were. I certainly can attest to that. But yeah, so why did it remain in your blood, so to speak?
Well, when I grew up, I was, directing a lot of kids. I kind of stayed a kid. I kind of was one of those guys that got older and always stayed kind of this kid.
Yeah.
And I found that most of the stuff that I like as a kid, I still like now. And most of the stuff I didn't like as a kid, I really don't like now either. But King Kong was something that was just so influential. I mean, I just was so aware of what great entertainment it was, its pacing and by the way, I mean, even as a young person, I started to, it affected me so much. I wanted to know about it. I wanted to know who were the guys that made it? How was it done? How were the special effects done? Did they use the 2-pack process? What kinds of mats were used? What kind of stop motion was done? How did Willis O'Brien use the rear projection photography, or projection of the miniature of the people in the miniature sets? All of that stuff became really fascinating to me, and so I studied and studied more about it. But I mean, things like, I mean, it's such an important, like, it's a watershed movie as far as music's concerned.
Oh, sure.
Zack Snyder had been hired in 1930 to go to RKO as the head of music, but he was just tinkering with things. He was doing little things here and there. Then he came in to do The Most Dangerous Game. He did The Bird of Paradise. And, he was still just kind of coming into it. And then comes King Kong, and it became this landmark score, which people kind of followed that guideline for almost 40 years. I mean, it was an amazing, amazing score that I always appreciated. My favorite composers were Korngold, Steiner, and Newman. But Steiner was first with what he did. And so I just absolutely couldn't believe how wonderful that was. And then the special effects, obviously, and they're, I mean, by today's standard, they're crude, but in those days, they were so innovative. And then everybody seemed to be having such a good time. I mean, Robert Armstrong, who was basically portraying Miriam C. Cooper, was way over the top, but enjoyed being over the top, and was the best Carl Denham. I mean, he was fantastic. Cabot was a bit stiff, and the guy that didn't really like women and then falls in love with Anne, and Fay Wray, she made so many movies. She made 11 movies in 1933. Obviously, the most famous and the one that put her on the map that everybody will remember for is King Kong.
Yeah, but I just rewatched Mystery of the Wax Museum, and she's great in that too.
Yeah, she's really good in it. I talked to her about this kind of stigma that followed around that she was the girl in King Kong, but she said, look, a lot of actresses in my day aren't that remembered anymore, and I'm grateful that I'm remembered for King Kong. I mean, even her autobiography was called On the Other Hand, because that was a reference to she was carried around in Kong's hand. I love that she embraced the fame that she got from that movie.
No, it's so cool. She was the Scream Queen long before Jamie Lee Curtis. She was the original.
Absolutely. And if you know the picture enough, you study the history of RKO enough, you'll know that her scream that went into the stock sound effects library was used in another group of movies, most notably in the 1939 Hunchback of Notre Dame, when they take Maureen O'Hara down to torture her to get her to confess to the killing of Alan Marshall. She starts screaming, and the scream is Fay Wray's stock scream from King Kong.
Amazing. Yeah, the longevity of that, right?
Yeah, like John Carpenter in 1982 when he remade The Thing. At the end of it, when it's the giant monster, the noise it makes, the growl it makes, is King Kong. He reused the Kong growl.
Says it all.
There's all these cool things about it, and so influential to a lot of people. But for me, it was common ground with effects guys, collectors, people who like those kind of movies, adventure film fans, science fiction film fans. It just was the best Beauty and the Beast story ever. So I still love visiting and watching that movie is like visiting an old friend of mine.
Yeah, it sounds like it keeps you young. It takes you back to your childhood, and that's magical when a movie can do that, and you could just surrender to it and recall when you were a youngster watching it. But also, as an adult, you can retain that childlike wonder, even though you know how the sausage is made now.
Yeah, I just loved that it was a part of my growing up. Like Fay Wray asked me once, "Why are you so crazy about this movie? Why have you seen it so many times? Why do you do things like the tributes to it?" And I said, because not only did it influence me, in my career, but to me, it was like an old friend. It was like visiting a friend of mine. I mean, I regard that movie as a really important part of my life, actually. When I was doing things like the Lassie show and things like that, I was actually handling all the miniatures that later became part of Forey Ackerman's collection and now are part of Peter Jackson's collection. They were in the miniature department. And when Paramount decided to disband all of that stuff when they took over the lot, all of those miniatures, they really, really carefully considered throwing them in the trash, which would have been a disaster. And then somebody said, no, let's not throw them in the trash. Let's just put them in open storage. And so under stage 32 at Paramount, you could go down a staircase, door was open, there was no lock on it. You could go under the stage, and in open storage were all the miniatures from King Kong that anyone could have walked in and taken. I could have taken them, you could have taken them, anybody could have taken them, but we didn't. We weren't dishonest people. We didn't want to take things from the studio. And then Forey Ackerman, bless him, found out that stuff was down there, and he made a deal with the studio that stuff should go on permanent loan to the Acker Mansion. He signed a thing saying, I don't own them. They still are the property of Paramount. Of course, originally the property of RKO, but they were absorbed by Paramount because Paramount bought the lot. And he said they were the property of Paramount. He had a deal with them to be on permanent loan, and should the studio ever want them back, they could get them back. And then 10 years went by, 20 years went by, 30 years went by, 35 years went by. And all of those people, all those files were all vaulted, and all the people making those deals were either retired or died, and Forey just kept everything. And luckily he did. Otherwise, those things may have been junked.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Now P. Jackson has most of them.
So if I were to ask you, what is King Kong's greatest gift to viewers, what would you say?
I think it set a standard not only for its day, but a standard that continued on for almost 40 years of what a really well-paced, well-thought-out, well-made adventure movie should be. And that's really important. And I also think that Kong, it's funny, in the movie, Carl Denham says in the very beginning of the movie, I'm going to go out and make a movie, then when I come back, they're going to have to think of a lot of new adjectives. And Kong-like and Kong-sized and became the adjective that he was actually talking about. So, when they made that movie, when they shot that scene, they had no idea that this picture would become as influential as it was. But it was really strange that he said that, because that's actually what happened. And so the influence of it, I think it set a standard for music and technology, and as filmmaking itself, and being just absolutely the best staple for those kind of movies, for adventure movies and for fantasy movies. I just think that's the king of all of them. When Ray Harryhausen saw Jurassic Park, he actually went to a screening with some guys at ILM, and he said, well, the computers, put me out of business, and my stuff compared to this is, and then he was kind of feeling down about it. And after the screening, Phil Tippett stood up and said, we owe all of this to you, Ray, because Ray was taught by Willis O'Brien, and O'Brien and Ray just led the way, and they were the guys. And I think King Kong, which was also Ray Harryhausen's most influential movie, set that standard as well. So we as filmmakers and people in the Hollywood community and people who enjoy those kind of films owe that film a real big debt of gratitude.
Well, that's just it, right? Because, it may look a little bit antiquated by today's special effects standards, but it fired up so many imaginations, and that's the key, the power behind a great film like King Kong, even at 90 years old.
Yeah, I mean, when we were kids, we all felt sorry for Kong, who, was smashing things and killing people and running all over the place. We felt sorry that he got shot down and fell off the Empire State Building. All my friends talked about it, that they felt sorry at the end of the movie, which people still feel. And think of it. I mean, someone took a 18-inch miniature and infused enough life into it that people watching the movie would feel sorry for it.
It's true.
I mean, it was fantastic. The whole thing was great.
Tell us about the Icons of Darkness exhibit and your participation in it. Are there any King Kong artifacts or memorabilia represented there?
The only King Kong artifacts, the only genuine King Kong artifacts I have are a couple of spears from the native village and a drum and things like that. Icons of Darkness is the largest collection of sci-fi, fantasy, and horror film memorabilia that's ever been put together. I've been collecting this stuff. It's part of my personal collection. I say part of it because the Icons of Darkness that's in Hollywood right now, at Hollywood and Highland, that's got about 48% of the collection in it, even though it's this vast amount of stuff. I have so much stuff. I mean, I've collected for almost 60 years. So it's this great collection of stuff, from superhero things, Marvel stuff, Batman costumes, Iron Man costumes, Superman costumes, that stuff. Then it goes into fantasy with, Lord of the Rings and Gremlins and Jurassic Park and all those things. And then it goes into horror with Freddy and Jason and Hellraiser and, everything you can think of. And these are all artifacts that I've collected of either the effects heads or the costumes. And those are then put on mannequins with the effects heads. It's really cool. It's really and a lot of it's interactive, where people jump at you and things like that. And those are all machines,
Wow.
So it's my honor to, preserve that history and to preserve those artifacts. Because when I first started collecting, I pulled this head out of the trash from a movie called Abbott and Costello Meet Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
One of my favorites as a kid. Sure.
Yeah, I was working at Universal on Beaver, and Jerry and I went up to the makeup lab, and they were just throwing things out. And I saw that in the trash. That's how the whole thing started. But
Wow.
I'm glad that what I'm doing is preserving a lot of this history.
Is this a traveling exhibit? Will it be coming to other towns?
No, right now it's a permanent exhibit in Hollywood, but I'm moving it to Las Vegas, to a much larger version of it.
And is there a website listeners can go to check out, how and where and when to see it?
Yeah, you bet. You can go to iconsofdarkness.com, and we can check it out. It tells a little bit about me. It tells a little bit about the collection, and you can see some reels of stuff. And it's a lot of fun. If you like science fiction, fantasy, and horror stuff, you're going to love this.
Sign me up, brother. Well, I can't wait to visit Vegas when it moves there. I'll definitely be making a beeline toward that exhibit.
Yeah, it's cool. It's really fun. It's one of a kind. There's never been anything like it.
Well, Rich, thanks for revisiting Skull Island with us today and tipping your cap to the king of the monsters on his 90th birthday. It was a real treat talking to you.
It's my pleasure. And again, I love that movie. So anytime I can help keep it alive, I'll do it. Thank you so much. Nice talking to you again.
Trust me, I wasn't kidding when I said I really want to see that Icons of Darkness exhibit someday soon. And who knows, maybe I'll even run into Rich as I'm standing jaw agape at all those horror movie artifacts. Thanks, Rich, for climbing aboard the venture and taking a fun voyage with us this month. It's time now for Standing Ovations. This is where I share a shout out to a film, book, TV show, website, podcast, or upcoming event that I'm confident will appeal to classic film lovers just like you. For March, I'm just simply going to name drop some other fan favorite films commemorating a milestone anniversary this month. So on March 6th, The Big Lebowski by the Coen brothers, that marked a 25th anniversary. On March 8th, you had Jacques Demy's The Young Girls of Rochefort, which rang in a 55th anniversary. Killer of Sheep, a highly acclaimed film by African-American director Charles Burnett, celebrated a 45th birthday on March 9th. 70th anniversary wishes go out to Kenzie Mizoguchi's Ugetsu on March 26th. Alfred Hitchcock's Treatise in Terror, The Birds, turns 60 on March 28th. And there's a 40th birthday in order just around the corner for Monty Python's The Meaning of Life, which celebrates that milestone on March 31st. Now, this, of course, is not a comprehensive list of every film ever released in the month of March that may have a 0 or a 5 attached to its anniversary year in 2023. But, maybe these birthday announcements compel you to explore or revisit one or more of these movies this month that are so worth your time. So go check them out. Like what you hear on Cineversary? We'd love to get your feedback. Whether you want to nominate a movie for a future anniversary episode, provide comments, or just have a question, get a hold of us at cineversegroup@gmail.com. That's CINEVERSE group@gmail.com. Also, you can really help our show grow by spreading the good word about the Cineversary podcast to your friends and loved ones. Even better, please leave a positive online review and rating, which significantly helps us get discovered by new listeners. So if you use Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or CastBox, simply search for the Cineversary page, look for a link that says something like ratings or reviews, click that, and leave that rating or review. While you're at it, take a moment to like us on Facebook, too. And if you'd like to go an extra step and help keep our show ad-free, consider making a donation to the Cineversary podcast by visiting tinyurl.com/donate Cineversary. We really appreciate your support. Lastly, we encourage you to visit cineversegroup.com. That's the portal for my private film discussion group I launched back in 2005, where you can hear recordings of our group discussions and read in-depth analyses about the different movies we study. Time marches on past March and into April, a month when temporal matters will command our attention at Cineversary. Next month, the clock tolls loudly to mark the 100th anniversary of an absolute gem of a silent screen comedy, Safety Last, directed by Fred Neumeier and Sam Taylor, and starring the incomparable Harold Lloyd. Now, for that installment, I'll be accompanied by none other than Harold's granddaughter, Suzanne, and I'll be reunited with this month's co-guest, Richard Correll, so lots to look forward to in April. Until then, this is your humble host, Eric Martin, reminding you to butter up that popcorn, live a big screen surround sound life, and yes, cherish those classic movies, because they're not getting older, they are getting better, and if Kong has any say in it, bigger. Thanks for giving us a listen.